I didn't expect anything to change that summer. But then Micah came back, and suddenly the silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was full of things we never said. And once you feel something real, something that shifts the ground beneath you, there's no going back. The summer air clung to the streets like a hush, thick and slow, curling around the edges of rooftops and trees that hadn't moved in hours. Elliot Rhodes sat on the porch of his mother's house, his fingers tracing the curve of a ceramic mug that had long gone cold. The sky overhead was a soft, bleached blue, and the sun filtered through leaves that trembled with every mild breeze. Everything around him looked familiar, predictable, safe. Yet, beneath the stillness, there was a quiet shift, something just beneath the surface waiting. The day had started like any other. Breakfast in the small kitchen with mismatched tiles. The distant hum of neighbors mowing lawns. The occasional bark of a dog echoing from across the street. But the mention of a name, dropped casually in passing by his mother, had unsettled something inside Elliot. "Micah Lane's back in town," she had said, not noticing how he paused mid-step on the stairs. "He's staying at the old Henderson house. Said he might stop by the shop." Elliot hadn't heard that name in nearly 3 years. Not since Micah left for school overseas, disappearing from the daily rhythms of the town without much warning. Back then, they had been close in a way that defied easy explanation. Not quite best friends, not quite strangers. Something in between, quiet and unresolved. Micah had been older by a year, more confident, always the one to initiate the plans, the jokes, the challenges. Elliot, quieter by nature, had followed in the wake of that energy, never fully understanding why he gravitated toward it so intensely. Now, years later, the thought of seeing Micah again sent a strange current through him. He spent the morning distracted, forgetting where he placed his keys, letting his coffee burn on the stove. The possibility of an encounter hung in the air, unspoken yet persistent. It was nearly noon when the bell above the workshop door chimed. Elliot was sorting lumber in the back when he heard the footsteps, steady, familiar, and then a voice that hadn't changed much, except for a slightly deeper tone and an edge of calmness he didn't remember. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a few moments to ground himself, to push down the flutter of anticipation rising in his chest. When he finally stepped forward, their eyes met, and the moment stretched longer than it should have. Micah stood in the sunlight, streaming through the doorway, hands in his jacket pockets, posture relaxed but eyes searching. His hair was shorter, his frame a bit broader, but the way he held himself, that quiet confidence, remained exactly the same. Elliot nodded a greeting, his voice catching slightly when he finally spoke. There were no dramatic reactions, no exuberant reunions. Just a quiet acknowledgement that something long dormant had stirred awake. Micah explained he needed help fixing a few things at the house. Nothing urgent, just odd repairs and a bit of heavy lifting. Ellie agreed without thinking too much. It felt natural, familiar. A return to something unspoken. That afternoon, they worked side by side in the dim, dust-filled rooms of the Henderson house. The silence between them was comfortable, broken only by the scrape of tools or the occasional exchange of observations about a loose window frame or a stubborn cabinet hinge. Elliot felt the rhythm of their movements settle into something steady, something easy. And yet, underneath the calm surface, his thoughts were a whirlpool. He found himself watching Micah in quiet moments. The way his brow furrowed while concentrating, the way he moved through the space like he belonged there. It was in the small things, the brush of an arm as they passed in the narrow hallway, the shared glance after a misstep on the ladder, the laughter that escaped too quickly and lingered too long. Elliot wasn't sure what any of it meant. He only knew that something inside him was shifting. As the sun began to fall toward the treetops, casting long golden rays through the house, Micah leaned against the doorway of the room they had just finished. His shirt was dusted with paint, and his arms were crossed loosely, relaxed. Elliot sat on the floor, wiping his hands with a cloth, pretending not to notice the way Micah was looking at him. The quiet stretched again, not awkward, just full, charged in a way that Elliot couldn't explain. There were no words spoken about what had passed between them years ago, about the looks, the long walks that always felt like something more than friendship, about the one night they had sat side by side under a thunderstorm, shoulders touching, silence too loud to ignore. Now, with the distance of time between them and the weight of memory sitting quietly in the room, Elliot felt the same pull, subtle but undeniable. They didn't speak of it. Not yet. When Micah left, the goodbye was soft, like a comma instead of a period. Elliot stood at the window long after his car disappeared down the street, his thoughts racing faster than his breath. He told himself it was just old friendship, familiarity, nostalgia, but something deeper had stirred, and he wasn't sure it could be put back to rest. The following days unfolded like pages of a slow-moving book, measured, quiet, filled with small moments that carried more weight than they seemed. Elliot Rhodes found himself glancing at his phone more often, though there were no missed calls or messages waiting. He told himself there was no reason to expect anything. After all, they had only fixed a few windows, patched a crack in the ceiling, shared a few casual laughs. That was all. But something about the way Micah had looked at him lingered. It wasn't overt. There were no confessions, no bold expressions. Just a sense, an invisible thread pulled tight between two people who weren't sure what they were feeling but could no longer ignore its presence. It was in the way Micah had paused before leaving, the way his eyes held a question that never made it to his lips. Elliot couldn't stop thinking about that moment. The summer heat had deepened, and the air hung heavier over Ashford's narrow streets. Elliot worked through his tasks each day with the same calm demeanor, but his thoughts betrayed him constantly. In idle moments, his mind wandered back to the Henderson house, to the way light had filtered through dusty curtains, to the quiet hum of being near someone who once mattered in ways that had never been said aloud. By midweek, Micah stopped by the workshop again. This time, the visit came without pretext. No toolbox in hand, no list of tasks to tackle. Just a casual mention that the backyard was a mess and an invitation to help clear it out. Elliot hesitated only a moment before agreeing. The backyard was overgrown with ivy and cluttered with forgotten furniture. The sun pressed down, and the air smelled of cut grass and old wood. Together, they worked side by side, pulling weeds and dragging rusted chairs to the curb. Conversation was light, scattered memories, shared jokes, nothing too deep. And yet, the silence between words spoke louder than anything. There were moments when Elliot could feel Micah watching him, moments when their arms brushed and neither of them moved away. Each time, Elliot felt his chest tighten, his breath catch. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was something else, something present, alive. When they paused for water, Micah sat on the back steps, stretching out his legs, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. Elliot leaned against the fence, the glass cold in his hands. Neither said much. The quiet between them had become a kind of language, unspoken but deeply understood. Elliot found himself observing details. The curve of Micah's smile when he wasn't trying. The way he ran his fingers through his hair when he was thinking. These were things Elliot hadn't allowed himself to notice before. Or perhaps he had, but never let the awareness surface. The afternoon sun dipped lower, shadows lengthening across the yard. They worked slower, more deliberately, dragging the final pieces of debris to the side. Elliot's shirt clung to his back, and dirt lined his forearms, but he didn't care. He wasn't thinking about the heat or the time or the ache in his hands. He was thinking about how different everything felt now. When they finished, Micah walked him to the front, his movements unhurried. Elliot almost said something real, but the words tangled somewhere between thought and breath. He offered a half smile instead, a nod, a quiet goodbye. And again, Micah lingered, as if he too had something unspoken resting on the tip of his tongue. Back home, Elliot stood in the shower longer than usual, the water washing away sweat and soil, but not the confusion. He couldn't define what was happening, couldn't place a name to the feeling that bloomed in his chest each time he saw Micah's face. It wasn't fear exactly, but it wasn't safety either. That night, lying in bed, Elliot stared at the ceiling as the hum of cicadas drifted through the open window. He remembered their last summer, before Micah left. How they used to sneak out late at night and sit by the reservoir, feet in the water, heads tilted toward stars. There had been a closeness then, a quiet rhythm between them. But they had never talked about it, never acknowledged the flickers of something more. Now it had returned, familiar and frightening. Elliot wasn't sure what was worse, the way it pulled at him or the fact that he wanted it to. The days grew slower, heavy with the weight of late summer. The town quieted, its streets shaded by trees in full bloom, their leaves shimmering in the hot breeze. Elliot Rhodes found himself in a strange state of waiting. Not for an event exactly, but for something he couldn't name. The world around him continued its quiet cycle. Shops opened, people moved about, the sky changed color and deepened, but something in him had shifted, and nothing quite fit the way it used to. Micah Lane hadn't stopped by since they cleared out the backyard. Elliot told himself it didn't matter, that they were just reacquainting, just catching up, that it was only the pull of old familiarity, exaggerated by the heat and quietness of the season. But even as he said those things to himself, he didn't believe them. One evening, after another long shift at the workshop, Elliot returned home to find the house unusually still. His mother had gone out to visit an old friend, leaving a note on the table and a casserole in the oven. He didn't eat. The thought of food made his stomach tighten. Instead, he walked. No direction, no destination. The air was cooling, the sky slipping toward indigo. Street lamps began to blink on one by one, casting long beams across the sidewalks. Elliot's steps carried him without thought, and before long, he stood in front of the Henderson house again. The porch light was on, glowing faintly behind the screen door. He hesitated at the gate, unsure why he'd come, unsure what he expected. But as he turned to leave, the door creaked open. Micah stood in the doorway, barefoot, wearing a faded t-shirt and loose sweatpants. His expression shifted from surprise to something softer, something that looked like understanding. Elliot didn't speak. He simply stepped inside when Micah moved aside. The house smelled faintly of dust and wood polish. A fan whirred in the corner of the living room, and an old record played somewhere in the background. Low, melancholic jazz that barely filled the silence. Micah motioned toward the couch without a word, and Elliot sat, his hands folded tightly in his lap. The minutes passed slowly. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The quiet between them was no longer awkward. It had transformed into something else, dense, intimate, charged. Elliot could feel Micah watching him from the other side of the room, could sense the tension in the air thickening with every breath. There had always been a line between them, invisible but real, drawn years ago and left untouched. That night it blurred. Micah moved first, not quickly, not dramatically, just a few steps closer, until he sat beside Elliot with their knees nearly touching. There was a stillness in his posture, but his hands trembled slightly against his thighs. Elliot noticed, and something inside him gave way. He didn't lean in, didn't reach out. He simply turned his face slightly and looked into Micah's eyes. That moment stretched, folded in on itself, and then dissolved. Micah's hand brushed against Elliot's. Barely, just a trace of skin on skin. But it was enough. Elliot didn't pull away. The weight of that single touch settled over him like fog. It was gentle, almost uncertain, but it carried the weight of everything they hadn't said over the years. Their fingers remained there, touching but not interlaced, both of them holding still as if afraid to scare the moment away. There was no kiss, no dramatic fission, just closeness, and that was louder than anything else. Later, Elliot would remember how the room had smelled, like heat and dust and something unspoken. He'd remember the way Micah had finally exhaled, as if he'd been holding his breath for years. He'd remember how the light from the porch cast shadows against the wall, and how those shadows seemed to settle over them like a blanket. Eventually, Micah stood, walking to the kitchen for water. Elliot followed a few minutes later, leaning against the counter, their shoulders brushing again. Still no words, just a soft familiarity returning. Or maybe something new beginning. When Elliot left, the sky had turned fully dark. The porch creaked under his weight, and crickets had begun their nightly chorus. Micah didn't walk him out. He stayed at the door, his silhouette framed in warm light. Elliot walked home slowly. His mind wasn't racing. It was quiet. Something had changed, but for once it didn't feel wrong. The days that followed were marked by a stillness Elliot couldn't explain. Everything around him carried on. Birds sang in the early hours, the heat crept in before noon, and customers continued to drift in and out of the workshop, but something inside him had shifted. It was subtle, like a new thread woven into an old fabric. Barely visible, but undeniably present. Micah didn't call, didn't text, but Elliot didn't expect him to. Whatever had passed between them that night wasn't the kind of thing that demanded follow-up. It lingered on its own, suspended in memory and breath. A small, quiet certainty beneath the surface of everything else. Elliot noticed the change in the way he moved through the world. He no longer avoided the places Micah might be. If anything, he sought them out unconsciously at first. The grocery store near the Henderson house. The old record shop 2 streets over. Even the trail near the edge of town where they used to walk summers ago. The possibility of running into him no longer filled Elliot with hesitation. It stirred something closer to calm. One evening, just before dusk, Elliot found himself again in motion without direction. His feet took him past the library, across the old bridge where kids carved initials into the wooden beams, and eventually down the gravel road that led to the reservoir. He hadn't been there in years, not since the summer before Micah left. The water shimmered under the dimming sky, still and wide, reflecting the fading orange glow. He walked along the edge until he reached the place they used to sit, an outcropping of flat stone just above the shore. He lowered himself slowly, brushing his fingers along the familiar ridges carved by time and wind. For a long while, Elliot just listened, to the wind in the trees, to the water lapping gently below, to the silence within himself. It wasn't empty anymore. There was noise there now, unformed thoughts, questions with no clear answers, feelings too new to name. The sound of footsteps behind him didn't startle him. Somehow he already knew. Micah sat without a word, leaving just enough space between them. Not too close, not too far. The moment settled quietly between them, like dust on an old book. They didn't speak, but the silence was not a void. It was full of memory, of tension, of understanding. Elliot glanced over once, catching Micah's profile as he looked out over the water. There was something in his expression that mirrored Elliot's own, an ache tempered by something gentler. Not regret, not fear, just awareness. The air grew cooler as the sun disappeared completely. The colors in the sky gave way to deep blue, and the first stars began to blink into view. Elliot pulled his knees up to his chest, wrapping his arms around them. His fingers grazed the stone beneath him, grounding himself. Micah's hand moved slightly, just enough for their knuckles to brush. They remained that way for a long time. Eventually, Micah stood. He didn't say goodbye. He just turned slightly, his gaze lingering for a second longer than it needed to. Elliot nodded once, and then he was gone. Elliot didn't move for several minutes after. The walk home was slow and quiet. The town had fallen into its evening hush, windows glowing with soft lamplight, porch lights flickering to life one by one. Elliot felt the weight of the moment settle into his chest like warmth. He wasn't sure what to call it, but it didn't feel fragile. It felt real. At home, the hallway light cast a golden arc across the floor. Elliot stood in the doorway of his room, the silence of the house wrapping around him. He didn't reach for his phone, didn't replay conversations in his head. Instead, he lay down on the bed, fully clothed, the window cracked open to let in the sounds of the night. He stared at the ceiling for a long while, breathing in time with the distant rhythm of crickets and wind. It didn't feel like the beginning of something, or the end, just a truth that no longer needed to be hidden. Summer waned slowly, like a candle burning down to its final hours. The days were still warm, but the light had changed, softer, longer, more golden. Elliot Rhodes began to notice the way shadows shifted across familiar sidewalks, how the air held the faintest trace of something cooler. Time was passing, even if everything inside him felt suspended. Since the evening by the reservoir, Elliot hadn't seen Micah. Not in person, not face to face, but there were signs, evidence of his presence, scattered across the quiet places they once shared. A freshly trimmed path near the old train tracks. A paper cup resting on the bench outside the bookstore. A half-read book left under a tree in the park. Elliot noticed all of it, and he held each detail with quiet care. He didn't seek him out. He didn't reach out, but he remained open, quietly waiting, without knowing what for. At home, the days followed their usual rhythm. His mother moved through her routines, unaware of the change blooming beneath her son's calm exterior. Elliot continued working, continued walking, continued living with a steady breath. But beneath all of it, he carried something new. A small, unspoken thing. A memory not fully formed, but rooted now, taking hold. One afternoon, while cleaning shelves at the workshop, he found a photograph tucked inside a stack of old notebooks. It was from years ago, one of those blurry, spontaneous shots someone else must have taken during a summer bonfire. In the photo, Elliot and Micah were sitting side by side on the back steps of someone's house. Elliot was laughing, head tilted, eyes crinkled. Micah's face was turned just enough to catch the light. His smile was quiet, but full. Elliot held the photo longer than he meant to. He slipped it into the pocket of his jacket without a word. That evening, Elliot walked down to the bookstore. He browsed without intention, letting his fingers drift along spines and covers. He wasn't looking for anything. Or maybe he was. As he turned a corner near the back of the shop, he paused. Micah stood there, eyes scanning the poetry shelf, one hand in his coat pocket, the other resting gently against a worn hardcover. He didn't notice Elliot at first, and for a moment, Elliot watched in silence, the air between them tightening with something almost electric. But not sharp, not tense, just full. When Micah finally turned, his eyes met Elliot's without surprise, as if he had known, somehow, that he would be there. They didn't speak. Instead, Micah closed the book, returned it to the shelf, and took a slow step forward. Elliot mirrored him. They stopped just close enough to feel each other's breath. No words were needed. Their eyes held the things they hadn't said. The late nights, the almosts, the silences that had meant more than any sentences. And then, without force or urgency, Micah reached out, brushing his fingers against Elliot's wrist. A small, deliberate touch. Grounded. Present. Elliot didn't flinch. He didn't move away. Outside, the sun had begun to set, painting the shop windows in amber light. Dust floated gently in the beams of sunlight that streamed through the glass. The world continued on around them. People passed on the sidewalk. Conversations buzzed from the front counter, but inside that small moment, time softened. Elliot lowered his gaze for a breath, then lifted it again. Micah smiled, not the easy grin of their childhood summers, but something quieter. Real. His hand slipped away, but the warmth of the gesture lingered. They left the store together, walking without a destination. Step by step, side by side. Their arms brushed once, then again. Still, neither said a word. The silence between them had transformed completely now. No longer tension, no longer question. It had become a language of its own. By the time they reached the reservoir trail, the sky was fully dark. Stars freckled the sky. Elliot paused near the clearing, and Micah stopped beside him. They stood together, watching the reflection of moonlight on water, the ripple of wind across the surface. There were no declarations, no dramatic promises, just presence. That was enough. In the quiet of late summer, as crickets sang and trees whispered, two hearts found something neither of them had expected. Not closure, not conclusion, but beginning.